The Beach Boys with God Only Knows from their classic 1966 album Pet Sounds. The creation of that record is brought to life in spectacular fashion in the new film Love and Mercy. Released in theaters just a few months ago, the film is heading to DVD and Blu-ray on September 15th. It's an unusual film, not your standard rock and roll biopic, because Love and Mercy focuses on two separate periods in Brian Wilson's life. During the mid-'60s, when Brian is played by actor Paul Dano, and the 1980s, which sees actor John Cusack stepping into Brian's shoes. Paul Giamatti plays Brian Wilson's controversial therapist, Eugene Landy, and Elizabeth Banks rounds out the cast as Melinda Ledbetter, the woman who spearheaded the campaign to remove Brian from Landy's nefarious clutches, and who eventually married Brian Wilson. David Beard joins us again. He's a frequent guest and a popular guest on this program. And, of course, he's the editor of Endless Summer Quarterly magazine. His insight into the group is remarkable. And this summer, he had the honor of writing and designing the Beach Boys' current tour program. And no less than Beach Boy Mike Love called it the best tour program he'd ever seen. David, welcome to our third annual Beach Boys Bash, and how are you?
I'm fantastic. Whenever anybody says welcome to a Beach Boys Bash, I'm all about it.
You know, I'd like to begin our discussion of this film and eventual DVD release by singing the praises of John Cusack, because he's sort of overlooked in all this. Paul Dano did such a remarkable job capturing the 60s Brian, and the film does a remarkable job capturing that era. But I thought he was terrific as Brian Wilson in the 80s. When it was announced that John Cusack was going to play Brian, I have to admit I was skeptical. But within 5 minutes of watching the movie, I totally bought it.
Yeah, I've been very familiar with Cusack because, I think the first movie I saw him in was back in the early 80s, One Crazy Summer with Demi Moore.
Sure, Better Off Dead. I mean, he's a very familiar name. Familiar actor.
High Fidelity.
Sure.
Say Anything.
Yeah.
On and on and on. And he's done many films that I've seen through the years that I've really enjoyed. Two things that I came away with. I really felt like everyone involved in the film, whether they were on screen or off screen or behind the scenes, that everyone cared about the subject. And there was a lot of love that went into the film. And I actually came away afterwards feeling even more compassion and love for everybody. And I don't mean just Brian and Melinda and their situation and their relationship. I mean everybody.
Yeah.
What the film does very well is it shows us, the 60 scenes show us a young man at his creative, just on fire. You're watching a guy who's creating incredible stuff, and then you're suffering with him as he's going through these auditory hallucinations. He's hearing things and experiencing things that do come, as we learn, as we're shown in this film. How is it 100% accurate? I think so, but I'm not sure. That came after Brian started using drugs.
Right.
Now, the issues that were shown in the film that exist prior to the drug use was the relationship that Brian had with his father.
Right. Well, the film draws parallels between Brian's issues with his father, who grew to resent Brian as the Beach Boys became successful, and then Dr. Landy, who became a father figure in the worst way to Brian. And I think the drug use only served to exacerbate an existing mental issue that Brian had. And before we talk about Dr. Landy, I want to stay in those 60s scenes because they're just so well done. I mean, it looked like all of the photos I had ever seen in Beach Boys books for the past 30 years came to life on screen. Yeah,
they did an incredible job. Darian Sahanaja, who's in Brian Wilson's band, was kind of the guy he was the guy. They chose Darian to find the right people to play those parts because it was important to Bill Pohlad, if they could do it, to hire somebody who could not just sit there and play the part and pretend to bang on the piano, but actually somebody who could play the piano,
right?
Who knew the songs, And one person in particular who I know is a dear friend, that's Gary Griffin. And Gary ends up playing Al DeLore. Doesn't look anything like Al DeLore, but that's beside the point.
Right.
For the idea of how the give and take took place, and it's right off of the Pet Sound Sessions box set, where Al DeLore plays a mistake on the piano, and Brian says, "What did you just do?" And he goes, I don't know, it was a mistake. I'm just noodling around. He goes, No, we're going to keep that.
Right.
And just as a quick side note, the Wrecking Crew DVD is out now. It's streaming on Netflix. If you have Netflix, check this out, because if you want to understand who these guys were, Glenn Campbell was one of them, so that's somebody your listeners would know. But you have to really check it out. If you have Netflix, go and watch The Wrecking Crew. And there's also a book out now called The Sound Explosion. It's a beautiful full-color book. It's 12 by 12, and it's just fascinating. Bruce Johnston called it a stellar book. Really a great read. So if you want to know more about these people who were on the other side of the booth that Brian was dealing with, please check those things out.
Well, let's hear a little bit of the Wrecking Crew in action. On this cut from the Pet Sounds album, here's I'm Waiting for the Day. We're talking with Endless Summer Quarterly's David Beard about the Brian Wilson biopic, Love and Mercy, which is being released on DVD and Blu-ray on September 15th. And I've made a mistake, because it's really not a biopic. This is an examination of two periods in Brian Wilson's life. And I think it's important to draw that distinction, because there have been people that have said to me, is this a story about the Beach Boys? Will I learn something about Carl and Dennis? And in reality, no, you really won't, because this focuses squarely on Brian Wilson.
Right. We do see on at least two occasions the relationship, just briefly, kind of like umbrella, kind of perimeter relationship between the cousins Mike Love and Brian. We do see that. And they were very logical scenes. There's actually three. The one where Mike is questioning the lyrics to Hang On To Your Ego, which eventually, after Mike had some rewrite, becomes I Know There's an Answer. And you could still, even listening to the song as it was initially released as I Know There's an Answer, you could still pick up that this is a drug song.
Right.
But the scene was very logical. Mike is asking Brian, hey, all of a sudden, up until this point, we sang about surfing, then we sang about cars, then we sang about beach life and girls. I don't think that they thought anything about branding in those days. So I don't think it was that type of thing. I think it was just more about what is our identity, and our identity is not telling our listeners to hang on to their egos while having an acid trip. Right. That's at least not that I'm aware of. So, and that's where Mike was coming from. So no one was at fault here. Brian was writing what was on his mind. Brian was writing about his life experiences. Mike was going out and experiencing his own life with the other guys, and Mike was being very logical about it.
Let me just jump in here and address something. Mike's questioning of the lyrics being written for the group in his absence has been blown so out of proportion, you'd think it was the biggest sin in human history. Some fans will even say he had no right to question those lyrics. Who does he think he is? Well, Mike is the main lyricist for the Beach Boys, so naturally he would have a vested interest in what another lyric writer has written for the group, especially because he's going to have to sing a lot of those lyrics. And as you just pointed out, whatever records the Beach Boys released represent not just Brian, but every single member of that band. But the point I'm trying to make here is these incidents of questioning lyrics didn't stop Brian and Mike from collaborating on tons of songs afterwards. So they got through it. Whatever the issues were, they got through it. And it's not like these guys hate each other.
Yep, and that's something that's very important. You touched on something very, very important. Brian and Mike love each other. So if you think cutting down Mike is making Brian happy, you got another thing coming.
Yeah, and as you say, you had compassion for everyone after seeing the film. I felt the same way. there's a certain segment of the Beach Boys fandom that likes to blame the other guys for everything that happened to Brian. And I think the film accurately portrays that for a lot of what Brian was going through, the guys weren't around. They were on the road. Brian was back home in the studio.
Yes, we don't see Brian going to Mike and saying, hey, I'm hearing voices in my head, I'm having issues.
Right.
So Mike was kind of out of the loop. Now, that could be because, this is all, we're guessing here, but it could be because Brian wasn't comfortable talking to Mike about it because he knew that Mike would have said, you're so full of crap.
Right. Well, but then again, who was comfortable during that time period talking about something like that?
Well, exactly, and who knew anything about it, or would understand it, and who would have believed it? Think about this. This is Brian Wilson we're talking about. Here's a guy who had, by that point, completely changed the music industry. Was amazing everyone left and right, whether it was the studio musicians or the guys in the band, even if they were questioning the direction. How do you go from being like a hit-making machine to all of a sudden having the guy who's in charge of all that not being well mentally, and you don't get to see it happen because you're out touring?
Yeah.
And you come back, and he's a different guy. Who would understand that? If I'm Carl, if I'm Mike, if I'm any one of those guys, and my brother or my cousin or my friend, whatever category you want to be here, had a mental breakdown on an airplane or freaked out, and then he went home and said, I'm just going to stay home now, and I'm going to write, and you're going to come home, and you're going to see this is going to be great.
Right, and then he seemed fine after that.
Right, he seems fine, and they come home, and there are drugs.
Right.
Mostly marijuana, as far as they're aware. But Brian gets into all sorts of stuff. He gets into the LSD.
Right.
He gets into a bunch of uppers. He's taking all sorts of pills. And Brian, being the welcoming individual he is at that time in his life, he had a tendency to be a little bit too trusting.
Yeah.
I think the biggest misinterpretation in the Beach Boys history is they think Mike was angry at his cousin.
He was angry at what happened to his cousin.
He's angry at what happened to his cousin, and that his cousin let it happen.
Right.
And Mike probably, although I don't know if he'd admit this, may hold himself partly responsible because he wasn't there.
That was the song we've been talking about, Hang On to Your Ego, which eventually became the song I Know There's an Answer on the Pet Sounds album, 1966. David, in a few minutes we're going to have to take a break, and then I want to come back and discuss the Eugene Landy portion of the film Love and Mercy, which is coming to DVD on September 15th. But before we wrap up the 60s portion of the movie, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, the thing we should touch on, because I think it's misleading a little bit. Smile, I think, I have to be careful because I love Pet Sounds.
Right.
But I think Smile is probably my favorite collection of material by any group ever, anywhere. Cabanescence is just far and away my favorite Beach Boys song. And it's such an important recording to me that I was just relating this to a friend a few weeks back. When I visited Paris in the year 2000, I was in the Louvre, and I could not tell you what painting I was looking at, but it took up the majority of a wall. This is a big, big painting. And I was looking at it, and I was thinking about Cabanescence. I was looking at this thing and thinking, oh my Lord, this is such an incredible piece of work. And I thought, that's exactly what Cabanescence is to me. And it wasn't a Western Railroad painting.
Right.
It was this vast thing full of rich color that has faded over the years. That's just a really, really important historical piece of work. And that's why whenever I see a great picture or a great painting, I think of the Beach Boys. That's what they are to me. They are American art. And Smile, whether it's in bits and pieces or it's a completed vision, which they did manage to do in 2011, doesn't matter. those bits and pieces, whether they created a whole song like Good Vibrations or Heroes and Villains, or whether they're still in pieces, or Surf's Up is another great example. I mean, those recordings, the raw human emotion captured in Surf's Up, or the vocal workout in Heroes and Villains, or the sheer majestic beauty of Cabanescence. Those things, I mean, if you really listen to Cabanescence, I mean, it's a little angry when the train's coming down the track. But then all of a sudden, you're swooped back up onto the porch with Ma and Pa Kettle around the campfire. I mean, it's really an incredible recording. It brings to endless visions. Well, music, I think, in general, does do that. But no one does it like the Beach Boys. No one. And what we're shown in Love and Mercy is that Smile was shelved, but we're not really sure why. We just see Brian next to a wall of reel-to-reel tapes. We see Brian in a scene where he's with a bunch of musicians, where he's booked the studio. The Beach Boys are not there. The guy who's portraying Van Dyke Parks is there. Brian says, the vibes aren't right. I'm canceling this session. And that's after standing there for a number of hours. See, the breakdown of Smile was several different factors, but the number one factor was Brian Wilson, the creator.
Right.
He created something so vast, so majestic, he had so many different things going on that it was impossible for one person to complete it.
And I'll take it a step further. Maybe it was an album destined to be completed by the fans, because that's what's happened over the past 30-some-odd years. Since the outtakes surfaced, fans have been putting together their own versions of Smile, and there are endless possibilities and combinations for those pieces of music. We're back talking to Endless Summer Quarterly Magazine's David Beard about the forthcoming DVD release of Love and Mercy, the Brian Wilson movie. We talked a lot about the 60s portion of the film. Let's move into the 80s and early 90s portion of the film, the Eugene Landy era. Eugene Landy played by the great Paul Giamatti. Again, this film shows us the harrowing circumstances Brian went through under Landy's care, so to speak. I use that in quotes there, care.
Yeah.
And John Cusack does a great job. Elizabeth Banks is great during this. Anything you want to comment on about this portion of the film?
Yeah, the quick thing to say, which you touched on, and I do want to touch on this, is that in the 1960s, the father figure was the father.
Right.
He never had closure with him. Brian carried that, and probably carries it with him to this day, had just managed to deal with it better. But in the 70s, mid-70s, when they first hired Eugene Landy, and again in the 80s, they hire him back, late 82, to save Brian's life because he was in horrible shape by this point, nearly 300 pounds. You know, they were certain he was going to die. So they bring him back, and Landy takes off to Hawaii with Brian and saves his life. But as we know, and as we see in the film, because listeners have to understand, this film was done from the perspective of Brian's wife, second wife, Melinda Wilson. And so we see her portrayed by Elizabeth Banks. And so we see the 1980s scenes played out through her perspective and what was happening. And so we see the side of Dr. Landy that was the berating and the soul-crushing individual with Brian. I use the term soul-crushing because, again, in the 1960s scenes with the father, Murray, we see that same type of relationship, soul-crushing.
Right. Well, the film is drawing parallels between those two relationships.
Right. What to me is amazing is that Brian Wilson has still kind of created, over the years, this incredible canvas of his life that we get to hear in recorded form on LPs or cassettes or CDs or whatever it is that he has put out there for us, that we still are able to listen to in spite of what he has personally been through. whether it's his own personal demons or someone like Dr. Landy in the 80s, early 90s that was over-medicating him. And we only see a brief peek at that. I have first-hand accounts myself. Right. I have been told by people who saw Brian in 1990 at the Endless Summer Quarterly Convention out in San Diego, who were right there, who saw Brian's state, saw how his physical body was moving, tremors in his hands, Landy walking out with him afterwards, getting to the car and giving him pills.
Right.
Okay? This was not good for Brian. Landy, with the film ends up where Landy is removed from Brian's care. He's forced out, which was a good thing because we see Brian is happy now. He's married to Melinda now, and things are good. He's in a good place, and he's on the right medications, which help him deal with the auditory hallucinations.
Right.
That's our understanding of who Brian Wilson is today. But you and I know beyond that film that Landy lived in the bigger house, Landy had the better car, it just went on and on and on. And by the time, even on the Beach Boys' 1985 album, the self-titled album, Landy inserted himself as a songwriter, and I've been told from credible sources that he had written lyrics to several of the tracks, one being California Calling, and they had to come in and fix them because the lyrics were so awful. Landy got a taste of the celebrity life. He got a taste of what it's like to be a Beach Boy, and he got sucked in.
Yep.
He wanted to be a songwriter. So did Murray.
Yeah.
So that's the strangest part of all of it.
Oh, yeah, more parallels.
And if there's genuinely a bad person in the movie, we do see it's Eugene Landy. I like this term. My friend and his Beach Boys historian Peter Riem, who has the background in this, used the perfect term. Landy lost his therapeutic focus.
Yeah.
He stopped doing what he was hired to do. He stopped caring about Brian, and he cared more about himself. And therefore, he overdosed Brian on pills. And that is, we don't see that completely played out in the film, but we do see at one point how the Gloria, the housekeeper, had taken some of the pills and started putting them aside in a jar because she saw how Brian was being over-medicated. And that type of thing will cause, over a long period of time, which Brian was exposed to,
sure,
that will cause irreparable damage
to
your whole nervous system. And that did happen to Brian, and which, again, is why I marvel so much at Brian, because he still did what he did.
I wonder.
That song right there, that is a perfect example of the kind of beauty Brian could create under the most difficult circumstances, because that song, Melt Away, from Brian Wilson's debut solo album, 1988, was made under Landy's regime. We've been talking to David Beard, editor of Endless Summer Quarterly magazine, and we're going to shift focus now to the magazine itself. And what can you tell us about the upcoming fall issue?
I'm working on a few things. The next issue is kind of playing out in a way that I think it's going to, the first part of it, after we've been talking about the film. When I left the film, I felt so much compassion for Brian and the Beach Boys.
Right.
So my mind and my heart were immediately thinking about how can I execute that and get that into the pages of the magazine. And it's still evolving, but one thing for sure that we're going to see in the next edition, the fall edition, is an album called Adult Child, which is really unique. There's a couple of songs on there that are... Baseball is really interesting because it's probably the closest to finished. The rest of them sound... It's mostly a demo collection of recordings, And this is where Brian was trying to kind of get into a Sinatra thing where he was Still I Dream of It, which is an interesting song. It's over now. Brian going to a dark place. Although the material itself is, again, mostly demos, I think it's worth having a conversation about, just to understand it, because it's not out there officially anywhere, and I understand why. It's just demos.
Right.
But, we can listen to Love You, and we can understand that this is when Landy was there, and Landy was pushing Brian to finish that album. And a lot of people like that album quite a bit. Not the same results with Sweet Insanity years later in '92. Right. So Landy had a positive effect when it, came to music. So it's important. So Peter Riem, Beach Boys historian Peter Riem, is written a great piece. In fact, I just got it while we were talking. It delves into understanding who Brian Wilson was at the point that Landy came into his life in the mid-'70s. And after Love You, what Adult Child was and why it didn't go any further than it did and why it was rejected by the group. So it's not just a musical discussion. It's who Brian Wilson was, what he was going through, and how he was therapeutically treated. Just like the film. Then I've also completed, you and I have talked about No Peer Pressure, which was released back in April.
Right.
But, interviews do take time. And I have interviewed Al Jardine, Blondie Chaplin, Don Was, and Matt Jardine, plus a name you may or may not know, and some of your listeners may or may not know, Kenny Aronoff. Kenny, if anybody remembers the music videos back in the 80s of John Cougar Mellencamp or John Mellencamp or whatever, he's the bald drummer.
Right.
So that's in my mind's eye, when I was told about him being on the album, I knew in my mind's eye, okay, I do remember a bald drummer. And then I watched the videos again on YouTube, and I went, oh, yes, of course. But he played on a number of tracks. So what I've come to find out about No Peer Pressure is this was, and maybe this was why there was no credits in the album, this was not all of Brian's band members, his touring band. Unlike other albums in the past, in recent years, his band members are not on all the recordings, and some not on them at all. This is more of an album of music friends guest starring. I hope to be, again, the idea being that with these different interviews that we can reveal more about the recording process, more about how things changed from when these individuals that I've interviewed went in and initially recorded and what we got in terms of the finished product. One example, Runaway Dancer, before Sabu from Capital Cities became a special guest vocalist. It was called The Talk of the Town, and it was a song that featured Matt and Blondie.
Right.
Blondie on lead vocal all the way through.
Huh. Interesting. Well, because we're going to be running out of time, we do this all the time. People should know by now. They should have this memorized. But where would they go to find out information regarding Endless Summer Quarterly? Where to subscribe? Where to keep up with your Examiner columns? All that information.
Really, just Facebook. I mean, that's, I think, is probably the best place. I mean, there's going to be, in addition to whatever the content is in the issue, something pretty cool is coming up. And what I will just say is this. I've got a lot of really cool collectible things, in addition to most of those things being autographed. And we are going to start a campaign on Facebook within the next month, by the end of August. Mm-hmm. We haven't quite worked out all the details yet. But essentially what it will be is it'll be a new subscriber based on this Facebook post, and it'll be a certain number. We'll get all this swag, and it's going to be a big deal. It's going to be like all the acoustic sounds re-releases. It's going to be a serious swag attack.
Well, David, always a pleasure to have these discussions, and I know that so many in the audience look forward to these as well, and let's make the next one sooner than later.
Okay. Be well.
Yep, you too. I'll be in touch with you.